Yeah. Not. I have an awful lot of slides, and yeah, at the end. Yep. Whatever you like. But you have to give me presentation capability. Uh, okay. Yep. Uh, oh, okay. Can I start? Okay. One thing I want to point out is Avi has my slide deck. So if you want a copy of the slide deck, and you might want that because there are a lot of words I'm not going to say on the slides, and there are also links to a bunch of websites and documents and things like that that I used in putting this presentation together. So if you want to get details, you'll want to get a copy of the slide deck. This presentation is very long, so I'm going to put up some slides and I'm not even going to talk about them. I'll just say, here's stuff you might want to look at later. The title of this is What My Microbiome Means to Me. Now, when I put this together, I didn't even know what the microbiome was, so I had to do a lot of research. I spent about a month watching videos, reading documents, and so on, so I could learn about it. And this followed another presentation that I had done on epigenetics. And it turns out that epigenetics and the microbiome are closely related. And I'll point that out as I go through this. The microbiome was first thought of by a Russian zoologist. His name was Elie Mechnikov, and he had a partner, Paul Ehrlich. They won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1908 in recognition of their work. But Mechnikov himself developed some of the earliest concepts on aging, some of which were correct, and he advocated the use of lactic acid bacteria, lactobacillus, for healthy and long life. And this was the concept that later became known as probiotics, although he didn't call it that. He went to work with Louis Pasteur, and Louis Pasteur invented germ theory. He came up with the idea of germ theory, and that was that diseases were caused by germs. And it was a very important discovery. And Mechnikov worked with Pasteur, and at the time, cholera was rampant in Paris. And Mechnikov wanted to study cholera, so he made up something he called cholera soup, which was guaranteed to give him cholera, and he drank this soup. And the funny thing was, he didn't get sick, and this was kind of mysterious. Everybody else was getting sick, and a lot of people were dying, and he tried to infect himself, and he couldn't do it. So he got two of his friends to volunteer to see if they would get sick. One of them did not, and the other one almost died. So what was the difference between the healthy guys and the one who almost died? And Mechnikov hypothesized that the difference in cholera infection was due to differences in intestinal microbes, speculating that those who have plenty of beneficial ones would be healthier. Well, the issues of aging occupied a significant place in Mechnikov's works, and he attributed the longevity of Bulgarian peasants to their yogurt consumption. And his parents, his mother specifically, was Bulgarian, and she drank yogurt that was filled with a bacteria called Lactobacillus bulgaricus. That's what it's called now. And he thought that maybe it was protecting him from getting cholera. And it also gave the people in Bulgaria longer lifespans. So to validate his theory, he drank something he called sour milk every day throughout his life, but it was probably Bulgarian yogurt that he was drinking. His scientific reasonings on the subject were written in a book, The Nature of Man. He espoused the potential life-lengthening properties of lactic acid bacteria, such as Lactobacillus bulgaricus, in this book. And this concept, which we now call probiotics, he termed orthobiosis, was influential in his lifetime. But after about 1920, it dropped off in favor. He gave some lectures on this topic, and yogurt became massively shared and used throughout Europe. But then around 1920, it started to fall off. And then in the mid-1990s, until the mid-1990s, it was pretty much ignored. Then you see, here's a chart showing PubMed papers referencing the microbiome. And it didn't really start to take off until around 2006. And it didn't gain a lot of traction until the mid-2000s. So this is a relatively new science, the study of the microbiome. Turns out that we have learned there are more bacterial cells, and this is controversial. Some scientists say there are the same number of bacterial cells, and some say there are a lot more bacterial cells on your body than there are human cells, which means you are more microbiome than you are human. Your body contains about 40 trillion bacterial cells, viruses, and fungi, mostly yeasts. So that's a lot. The term microbiota refers to the microorganisms themselves. So the little microbes, they're microbiota. The microbiome is the DNA that they contribute. There are up to 1,000 species of bacteria in the human gut microbiome, a different role in your body. Most of them are extremely important to your health, and others, if they become prevalent, will give you diseases of various sorts. Altogether, these microbes weigh between 2 and 5 pounds, which is about the weight of your brain. 3 to 3.5 pounds is how much your brain weighs. So together they function as an extra organ in your body, and they play a huge role in your health. And they're collectively known as the microbiome. I did a Google search on microbiome, and I got 64.8 million hits. And I also did a search on the human spleen, because that's an organ too, and I got about the same number of hits. So the microbiome has become as popular in medical research as the human spleen. During the conduct of the Human Genome Project, scientists estimated that the number of genes in the human genome that would be needed to code for the proteins required to sustain human physiology would be approximately 100,000. Now, I'll hit on this in a second. Some DNA, now of all the DNA in your body, some of it codes for proteins and enzymes, but a lot of the DNA, in fact, most of the DNA, is actually the software that says, when do you produce a protein? How much of that protein do you produce? When do you stop producing that protein? So things like puberty, right? That's triggered by the software in your DNA that says, okay, it's now time to start producing the proteins that put you into puberty state. And it also encodes how much of those proteins do we generate, and when do we stop doing that? When do you leave that intense puberty period? And this is particularly important to women. So you have a period where you are not in puberty, then you are, and then later on, all your sexual function has to stop. So this DNA and its control mechanism that does that software piece, that's the epigenome. Researchers, when they did the Human Genome Project, found that there were only 20,000 proteins, only 20,000 genes, rather, coded for proteins. The same as very simple organisms like fruit flies. However, if you add in the human DNA to the microbiome DNA, now you get up to the 100,000 genes that they predicted you would need to operate as a human. So collectively, we are a superorganism, and we have a symbiotic relationship with that microbiome. And this is supported by the fact that the human microbiome provides traits which the human organism has no need to produce itself. And I'll show you how that works shortly. So what do microbiomes do? What do microbes do? Basically, they're chemical factories. They eat something like sugar, and then they produce something else like lactic acid as a byproduct of eating that sugar. And, you know, the way evolution works, the microbes have no goals. They just survive. They live. And if they happen to produce a chemical, that's not something they intend to produce. It just happens, right? The chemicals produced include things in our microbiome like vitamins and neurotransmitters, and short chain fatty acids and other chemicals that we use. They also help break down our food to produce energy and nutrients. Now, they don't do it for our benefit. They're doing it for their benefit, but the byproducts that they produce happen to be good for us. They produce chemicals that train and maintain our immune systems. And again, this is just a side effect, but it works for our benefit. They produce chemicals essential to development. So if you are born sterile of a microbiome, you will not develop as a normal human being. You will have problems later on. And they're the first line defense against pathogens. And they create colonization resistance. In other words, they fight off bacteria that are bad for you. So humans are in a symbiotic relationship with thousands of types of microbiota. And we benefit from them because they do things for us that we can't do on our own. And they get the benefit of being housed, fed, and propagated through generations. So it's a win-win. They win, we win. Your microbiome is all over your body. It's in your brain, it's on your scalp, it's in your ears, it's behind your ears, it's on your nose, it's in your nose, it's in your mouth, it's in your lungs, they're in your skin, they're in your gut, they're in your vagina if you're lucky enough to be a woman. Because each of these places in your body is a unique environment. So if you think of yourself as like a planet, you have deserts, you have swamps, you have rainforests, and so on. So the different kinds of organisms that can live in these different environments tend to live there. And if there's an environment that they can't live in, then they don't live there. But everybody's microbiome happens to be unique. If they take a fecal sample from two different people and examine what kind of microbes are in these two different people's guts, they find that they are totally different. There are in different amounts, there are in different kinds of bacteria, and so on. So some people have a whole different set of flora, or partially different than the people that live next door to them, and they're very different from people that live in different countries. The microbes that tune my immune system may be totally different than the microbes that tune your immune system. And that means I'm going to be prone to diseases that you're not, and vice versa. The microbes that impact my hormones may be different than yours. The NIH in 2008 set up a roadmap for medical research, and they committed $100 million to the Human Microbiome Project. And they want to investigate specifically 5 different sites: the oral cavity, the nasal cavity, the gastrointestinal tract, the genitourinary tracts, and the skin. So I'm going to take a look at the skin first. The skin is your largest organ. And a lot of people don't think of it that way, but the skin definitely is an organ. It's got trillions of microorganisms on it. They're known as the skin microbiome, and they're important to your health. But again, various areas of your skin support different kingdoms of microbacteria, including eukaryota, viruses, fungi, and then the bacteria themselves can be very different and of different types. And it just depends on whether that site is oily or not oily, moist or dry. The skin's microbiome is part of the physical layer that protects you from the outside world. So it's very important to your immune system. And the microbes in your skin act in a couple of different ways. One is they produce warnings when you get a skin infection, and that triggers your immune system to deal with those harmful bacteria or viruses. The microbes in your skin send out little chemical triggers that actually kick off an epigenetic response. And the epigenome, in response to those triggers, will start to produce different kinds of proteins that will either call for your immune system to respond, or it'll produce proteins that respond directly. They play a role in how your skin responds to UV light, the kind of light that gives you skin cancer. Signals from your skin microbiome can activate or deactivate your immune system, and that helps you heal and controls inflammation. And it also fights infection because some microbes act like a natural antibiotic. Penicillin is a natural antibiotic that was obtained originally from a mold. So we know that certain microbes have that kind of antibiotic effect. They also keep your skin acidic, which many germs that are bad for you don't like, so it wards off those germs. Now, when your microbiome is what we call normal, healthy, it does all these things for you, but sometimes it can become perturbed. And one of the things that can cause it to be perturbed is maybe you'll get an infection and your doctor will give you a lot of antibiotics, and the antibiotics kill off a bunch of your microbiome. Up to 30% gets killed off, and it tries to bounce back to normal. But what might happen is you have enough bad bacteria on your skin that don't get killed off, so that when it tries to return to normal, those bad bacteria outnumber the good bacteria. And this is called dysbiosis. And that's an altered stable state, which actually causes you to have a disease because you have a bunch of the wrong bacteria on your skin. And the diseases include a bunch of things which we treat with different kinds of compounds, and you get medicines from the drugstore and you try to treat these things, but in actuality, it's because you have an unhealthy microbiome that you have diseases in the first place. So how did this all evolve? Well, bacteria in the tree of life are the earliest living organisms. So they've been around for 4.5 billion years, a long time. Well, 4 billion years anyway. A long time before things like mammals were along, and a long time even before things like roundworms were around. Roundworms go back about 600 million years. So if we look at a roundworm, a primitive, simple organism, right, 600 million years ago, if it's an environment that happens to include lactobacillus, we know that lactobacillus eat sugars and they produce a lactic acid as a byproduct. Now, if the primitive simple organism comes into contact with these lactobacillus, the lactic acid, we know, repulses other bacteria. So that might be actually good for the primitive simple organism because it will keep it from being infected by bad bacteria. So that's a good thing. If the primitive simple organism provides an unfavorable environment, though, to the lactobacillus, it doesn't get that benefit. And that means it's going to have a lower viability for current and future generations. And that's a bad thing. It's not going to reproduce as well as a primitive simple organism that has a good environment for that lactobacillus, which would then give it a higher viability of current and future generations. So eventually, the ones with the bad environment for the lactobacillus are going to die off. And the ones that provide a good environment for the lactobacillus are going to reproduce at a better rate. So over time, given 6 million years or so, you're going to see that all of the roundworms are going to provide a good environment for the lactobacillus. Evolution is passive. It's not the intention of the roundworm or the intention of the lactobacillus. Their roles are passive. The roundworm's role is passive. It just happens to have a good environment. And the lactobacillus's role is passive. It just happens to find this good environment and thrive there. But the benefit is everybody wins. It's a win-win. So what happens if the bacteria triggers a favorable epigenetic response? The roundworm thrives. Wherever there is an increase of the viability of current and future generations, the organism and the bacteria will co-evolve in this symbiotic relationship. Now, this all happened with the roundworm 600 million years ago, long before complex mammals came along, but we are also the beneficiaries of that evolutionary phase. Wherever there is an increase of viability of current and future generations, the organism and the bacteria will co-evolve in a symbiotic relationship, and that's what happened with us. The host organism will depend on the microbiota to produce molecules that it needs rather than evolve to produce them itself, because it doesn't have to. So if we look at what's going on now in the genitourinary tracts, in a female, for example, you'll see that in the vagina, there's a lower vagina, there's a cervix, and there's an upper vagina. And the bacteria that live in these three areas are different. In asymptomatic, healthy women, several kinds of vaginal microbiota exist, the majority often dominated by lactobacillus. That's the one that eats sugar and produces lactic acid. Bacterial vaginosis is a condition that happens if there's a disruption of the equilibrium of the normal vaginal microbiota. And it changes over time. When you're a newborn female, you have a certain set of bacteria and lactobacilli in these areas, and that's considered normal. But then when you go to pre-puberty, a whole new set comes into existence. Now, how do they get there? We'll talk about that later too. But they do start to arrive and they start to propagate, and it provides an environment that's beneficial to pre-puberty. And then when you go into puberty, it changes once again. You get an increase in lactobacilli. Then when you go into menopause, it has to change. And notice it goes back to the state it was in primarily in pre-puberty. So it does a flip-flop. It goes from one state, state A, we'll call it when you're newborn, to state B, back to state A with Gardnerella and some other things, and then it goes back to state B again. So I talk about here what role it plays, and mostly it's a protective role. It prevents colonization of the host by pathogenic organisms. And the kinds of organisms that it protects you from include things like vaginosis, yeast infections, sexually transmitted infections, and urinary tract infections. Important stuff. They also change the pH level in the vagina. So they're important for that. So what can disrupt this? Well, if you use a lot of antibiotics, that's going to disrupt the levels of microbes in your vagina, and you end up with things like a yeast infection because you took a lot of antibiotics. Then you have to take something to correct the yeast infection. Hormonal contraceptives change the environment, and that changes the microbiota that live there. So certain kinds of birth control can upset it. Sexual activity can upset it because that's how new microbes get introduced in a lot of times. Vaginal lubricants will upset the environment. Douching can upset the environment, and these can all lead to disease situations. Now, of all of these, the only one that evolved with us over the past 3 million years is sexual activity. The ones in orange here, they're all new. That's all stuff we invented. So a lot of the diseases that we suffer from are the result of us inventing cures for diseases that at the time we didn't understand were being caused by disruption in our microbiome. If we go to the oral cavity, this is your mouth. This is what is the beginning of the alimentary canal. Now, the alimentary canal is a tube that runs all the way through your body. It starts at your mouth, ends up at your anus. So when you eat, that's the beginning of the alimentary canal. There's a microbiome in your mouth, and in fact, it's one of the biggest microbiomes in your body. Not the biggest, but one of the biggest. Lots of bacteria in there. It's filled with bacteria, viruses, and fungi within your mouth. They live in your saliva and every surface of your mouth, and they're very differentiated. The microbial flora on the lip side of your teeth is different from the microbial flora on the back side of your teeth. So it's highly variable. There are over 700 species of bacteria. They're in colonies on your teeth, your tongue, your hard palate, your gums, every crevice of your mouth. They consist of lactobacilli. Remember, that's the one that eats sugar, produces lactic acid. Bifidobacteria, we're going to hear about more later. That's a beneficial and necessary one. The rest of these end up giving you diseases if they become prevalent. So the third one would give you gingivitis, which is inflammation of the gums. Staphylococci will give you a staph infection. Streptococcus will give you a strep infection. Candida is a yeast infection. Veillonella I'm not familiar with. But anyway, they're in your mouth. They're there from the earliest days of your life if you grow up in a healthy environment. You have billions of these things in your mouth. And they do a lot of good things for you. They fight inflammation and systemic disease, maintain homeostasis. They provide antibodies. They transport oxygen to the gums. They remove waste from the surfaces of your mouth. They remineralize tooth enamel, so they're actually good for your teeth. And they promote well-being all through your body. They prevent oral diseases. And every time you swallow, they go down your throat and into your gut. So this is the gateway to your entire body in terms of microbiome. Systemic diseases, if this goes wrong, can include things like heart disease, diabetes, obesity, immune dysregulation, cardiovascular disease, digestive disease, immune diseases, and they even impact your nervous system, and they can give you periodontal disease. So a lot of things can result from having your oral microbiome go wrong. They've been linked to cardiovascular disease, which can result in strokes, high blood pressure, and endocarditis. And also hardening of the arteries, atherosclerosis can result, which can later on give you a heart attack. What people don't realize is they also contribute to your emotional and mental well-being. The gut-brain axis connection, which I'll talk about later, can also give you anxiety and give you depression early on and throughout your life. So having a bad microbiome, having an unbalanced microbiome is bad in so many ways. And nobody even knew this 50 years ago. So it can cause type 2 diabetes. It's associated with that very strong connection. And there's even a strong connection between gum disease specifically and type 2 diabetes. And remember, gum disease is related to the oral microbiome. It can result in obesity. And it can even result in adverse pregnancy outcomes like preterm birth, preeclampsia, low birth weight, higher rate of miscarriage, and even infertility. So your oral microbiome, extremely important, can relate to even sexual dysfunction. Who knew? Erectile dysfunction, vaginal dryness can result from an oral microbiome imbalance. Rheumatoid arthritis. There's a relationship between HIV/AIDS and the oral microflora of people that have it and don't have it. And now you have to ask the question, is the imbalance in microflora a result of the HIV/AIDS, or is it the cause of the HIV/AIDS? And I would submit that neither one of those things is actually true. It's a relationship between the two. Remember, there's also a tie-in to epigenetics with all of these things. Osteoporosis, periodontitis, loss of bone mineral density have all been linked to the oral microbiome, chronic liver disease. So after all of that, you swallow, and all of these microbes that we've been hinting at now enter the upper part of your alimentary canal. So now we're into the gastrointestinal tract. Now, something that few people understand also is the relationship between your senses and your brain. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how your brain works now. You have an organ in your brain called the thalamus, and the thalamus acts like a switchboard in your brain. So when you look at something, for example, the input from your eyes goes first to the the thalamus. And the thalamus takes that input from your eyes and sends it to various parts of your brain because it has to be processed in parallel. It can't be processed by one part of your brain because the parts of your brain are highly specialized. So there's a part of your brain that just looks at outlines. What is the outline of what I'm looking at? And then there's another part of your brain that says, well, what is the color of what I'm looking at? And is there a variation in the colors of what I'm looking at? And then there's another part of your brain that relates visual input to memory. Have I seen this before? And it also has to link it with auditory input, because if you're looking at somebody and they're speaking, you have to relate what you're hearing to what you're seeing. So your thalamus is directing your visual input to all these different areas of your brain. But there's one set of inputs that go directly to your brain. They do not go through the thalamus. That's the sense of smell and the sense of taste. And they go straight to the parts of your brain that deal with emotions, memory, and require immediate response. And if you think about how microbes had to deal with their environment, the first thing a microbe had to do was sense chemicals in its environment and know whether it should go towards the source of that chemical or run away, swim away from the source of that chemical. So that's your basic sense of smell and taste right there. And it goes all the way back 4 billion years. Now, because it goes directly to your brain, that analysis of smell and taste is a very powerful mechanism that improves the viability of current and future generations, really important for survival. So the connections of smell and taste with the brain are paramount. So now the question is, does your digestive system have a similar importance? Because if it does, then there must be a connection between your gut and your brain. And we've recognized this in our language. We say idioms like, trust your gut. When you're in a situation where you have to make a decision, you can't rationalize it, you trust your gut because you have a gut reaction to what you're seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting. And if you're nervous, you get butterflies in your stomach. And if you're nauseated by something you see, you get sick to your stomach, either literally or figuratively. So let's think about then how important this is to survival, right? The way your brain works in terms of survival is there's a reward and punishment mechanism. And that reward and punishment starts immediately. If you taste something that's sweet, your brain says, this is good. But how does your brain know? Because there's a direct connection between your sense of smell, your sense of taste, and your brain. And it turns out that in nature, nothing that is poisonous is sweet. So you taste it, it's sweet, you say, okay, I can swallow this. And it's not even a conscious thought. It's just something you can do. But what if you swallow it and 4 hours later, you're sick to your stomach, right? Now your brain has to be told, hey, that thing you ate 4 hours ago that you thought was good, it's making you sick. Or what if you eat a mushroom and 12 hours later, you start to hallucinate? Now your brain has to say, whoa, maybe I shouldn't eat that thing because this is threatening my survival. If I don't see reality for what it is, I could die from this. So a connection like this would be very, very important. I'll get back to this. Now, food is partially digested in the mouth, but the stomach contains digestive juices and enzymes that break it down even further, and it goes to more basic components. And your stomach is a muscle, and it flexes, and it's taking your solid food, and it's trying to turn it, and we hope you chewed it up well enough, but now it's trying to turn it into a mush that can flow through the rest of your digestive system. We don't want any hard things in there. So it flexes through digestion, and then the results go to that oval space after the stomach. That's called the duodenum, and from there it goes to the small intestine. So in the duodenum, there's a bunch of gut microbiota. There's not a lot in your stomach because of the environment in your stomach. It's not conducive to microbiota, but the duodenum can support a bunch more. So they help too with the digestive process, and they break up things like fiber, sugars, and so on. From there, it goes to the small intestine. Your small intestine is a really huge piece of this organism. It's about 22 feet in length in humans. So lots and lots of surface area in there. And then that surface area, what happens is you've been breaking all your food into very small molecules, and they include sugars and amino acids and fatty acids, and these get absorbed through the walls of the intestine, go into the bloodstream and fat transporting vessels, and carry them to other parts of the body where you use them for energy and so on. When your digested food, partially digested, still leaves the small intestine, it goes into the large intestine, and it goes into a part of the large intestine called the cecum. Now, the cecum contains the largest part of your gut microbiome. There are 100 trillion bacteria in the body of an adult human, containing about 4 million different bacterial genes, and more than 95% of them are in the cecum. That's where they are, 95% of them. So a lot of important stuff is going on in the cecum. By the time the food gets there, it's mostly digested, but your large intestine absorbs water, and it turns that mush into something a little more solid. It absorbs minerals and some of the remaining nutrients from your food. And the bacteria that's in there primarily is used to break down fiber, and fiber is really important. It's important for your diet because it contributes to your digestive health and prevents constipation, but it also secretes vitamin K, which is important for digesting minerals like calcium, and vitamin B, and you can absorb it here. Now, vitamin B only comes from eating certain foods, primarily, in most people, red meat. So if you don't eat red meat, you're not producing a lot of vitamin B in the cecum. You have to get it from someplace else. But if you do eat red meat, you need vitamin B. That's where it happens. Now, it would help the viability of current and future generations of any creature if the gut could somehow tell the brain, eat more of this. It's got a lot of fiber. It's got a lot of sugar. It's got a lot of fats. It's got a lot of salt. Or eat less of this. It's got a lot of some mineral that's making me ill, or it's upsetting the digestive process, or it's destroying the bacteria, or don't ever eat that again, right? So somehow the bacteria themselves have to tell the brain that this is a source of vitamin K, or this is a source of sugar. So what happens is the gut bacteria secretes hormones that communicate with your epigenetics in a way that affects the brain. And the brain secretes hormones in return that affect the gut and will make the gut a better environment for the microbes that are beneficial. So when you have cravings for certain foods, this is how that craving happens. How does your brain know what's going on in your stomach or in your gut? It's through this whole mechanism. Inflammation of the gut causes messages to be sent to the brain too, which tell it, this is a bad thing going on here. So where does this microbiome all come from? Okay, we have to get to this because it's important to know where you get your microbiome. So before you're born, you're in the amniotic sac. There is very little microbial activity in the amniotic sac. There's a little bit, but not a tremendous amount. The first time you're exposed to microbes is when you pass through the mother's birth canal. So there's a lot of microbial activity going on when a baby is born because of the process of natural childbirth. So natural childbirth is very important for the health of a baby. Now, one of the things that's disrupted this recently in human history is the introduction of C-sections and cesarean birth, which bypass that process. So if you're born by C-section, you're going to have a tendency to be prone to diseases and problems that you wouldn't have had you had a natural childbirth. There are ways to compensate, but if you don't know this, you don't know to compensate. And 50 years ago, we didn't know there was a need to compensate, so it didn't even happen. That's called the commensal microbiome, and it's involved in brain development, immune system development, overall health, appetites early on, anxiety, mood, happiness, learning and memory, and complex behaviors, which we'll address in a minute. And as you grow, your gut microbiome begins to diversify, and you get more and new different kinds of microbial species. And the higher the microbiome diversity is, the healthier you tend to be. So by the time a child goes to school, when they get to be about 5 years old, there should be about 100 trillion microorganisms in their microbiome. If you look at this chart, you'll see that in pregnancy, very, very low diversity in the microbiome. Then at birth, and even before birth, the maternal diet, whether gestational diabetes is a problem for the mother, environmental exposures, all impact what her microbiome is and how that microbiome is going to be passed on to the child at birth. Then there's the gestational age. Is the child being breastfed, or is it getting formula? Is it being exposed to antibiotics? And then later on, what solid foods is the baby getting? Because if the solid foods it gets don't include a diversity, then there's not enough prebiotics to support the macrobiotic environment in the child's gut, and so on. And as the child gets older, are they subjected to restricted diet, infections? What kind of sex hormones do they produce? And what environmental intoxicants are they exposed to? And that's going to impact the microbial abundance and the diversity. It turns out that the early on microbes are the most important because they're going to impact species accumulation for the rest of your life. So if you're a parent or thinking of becoming a parent, this is very important stuff. And if you go through my epigenetics talk, you'll see some of the important factors that are related to this. So early life gut microbiota relates to a lot of things: childhood obesity and overweight phenotypes as early as 2 years, based on these things. So as a child, the ability to digest breast milk depends on a certain bacteria, bifidobacteria. If you don't have that as a baby, you can't digest breast milk. So how do you get that? Well, one way is through something like kissing, because if you remember, in the oral microbiome, one of the things that you have in your mouth is lactobacilli, which is important for digesting milk in general, and bifidobacteria, which is necessary to digest breast milk. So kissing contributes to the viability of current and future organisms for humans. So this may be how the act of kissing even evolved. And that means that kissing is necessary for the species to survive. So one of the things you have to do in your gut is digest fiber. Fiber is important. Fiber produces or is converted to short chain fatty acids, and they're important for gut health. It helps you prevent weight gain, diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. It helps your immune system also by communicating with your immune cells to also keep you healthy in your gut. It helps control brain health, and I'll talk about that a lot in a minute. Microbiota genes encode for enzymes and structural proteins, and they influence the functioning of mammalian cells. The gut microbiome can be viewed as an anaerobic bioreactor, in other words, bacteria that don't require air to thrive, that are programmed to synthesize molecules which direct the mammalian immune system and modify the mammalian epigenome and regulate host metabolism. So microbiota code for enzymes and structural proteins that are programmed to synthesize molecules that direct the immune system, modify the epigenome, and regulate your metabolism. And most of that happens where? In the cecum. So let's do some science now. If we want to test everything I've just said, we have to have an animal, preferably a mammal, that has an alimentary canal that looks a lot like humans. Well, let's get a lab mouse, because they're really good for this. And we have to produce a germ-free mouse. So how do you do that? How do you have a mouse that doesn't have a microbiome? Well, what you do is you create it using cesarean birth, and you immediately put it into a germ-free environment where it's isolated from all microbes, and then observe it. Turns out germ-free mice show developmental abnormalities. So being germ-free is bad for your development. And they're totally reversible, though, early in life, if the germ-free mouse is colonized with intestinal bacteria from a healthy mouse. So early in life, you can fix that. So if a child is born with by cesarean birth, and they're not given the opportunity to be exposed to microbes from a healthy human, they're going to suffer from it. Somebody's trying to say something? Lou? Yeah, no? Okay, moving on. If you wait too long, though, it doesn't work. And that implies that a healthy microbiome influences brain development to a large extent. When compared with conventional mice, germ-free mice are less vigilant and less cautious. Now, being less vigilant and less cautious would be a very bad thing for the future viability of this strain of mouse, right? Because this diminished anxiety is going to make it vulnerable to predators. And it turns out this is related to elevated levels of striatal norepinephrine, elevated levels of dopamine, and elevated serotonin turnover. And all of those things change the behavior of the mouse. And all of those things, by the way, I'll show you in a minute, are created in the gut. Elevated plasma levels of, well, we don't have to talk about that, but it's all related to heightened stress reactivity too. How does the mouse respond to stress? And I'll show you some experiments related to that. Now in rats, a germ-free rat is different than a mouse in the way its behavior has changed. It's less active and more cautious than conventional rats. But both of these behaviors are related to the microbiome directly. So a germ-free mouse is going to behave differently than a mouse with a healthy microbiome, and the same is true of rats. The increased risk-taking of germ-free mice or the withdrawal of risk of germ-free rats can significantly impair survival in the wild, where they need to gather food, and it should be balanced against the need to avoid predators. So this has strategic evolutionary importance, and that's why it has to be directly associated with the brain. So here's another experiment. There are two types of laboratory mice, very common. One is called a BALB-C mouse, and it has a microbiome that's specific to that mouse. And there's a behavior associated with that mouse. It's more susceptible to stressors. In other words, it doesn't deal well with stress, okay? It gets really nervous, it doesn't behave well, it runs around, and it doesn't react well in a way that's going to help its survival. Now, the Swiss mouse has its own microbiome, and it's less susceptible to stressors. So an experiment you could do is you could say, well, let me take a BALB-C mouse, make it germ-free, and then introduce the microbiome of a Swiss mouse into the BALB-C mouse and see how it behaves. And do the same thing with the Swiss mouse, right? Change its microbiome. And they've done this, and it turns out that the behavior follows the microbiome. It's not the mouse, it's the microbes in the mouse that determine its susceptibility to stress. This fellow, John Cryan, and I only put this slide here so you could go watch his TED Talk. He's a neuroscientist in Cork, Ireland, and he and his graduate students did this experiment, which is extremely telling. They fed a group of mice Lactobacillus rhamnosus, and they had another control group of mice that were just fed broth. All right, so that's the difference. The only difference between these two sets of mice is one of them got a whole bunch of this particular lactobacillus and the other did not. Then they were put under water stress. They're put into a bowl of water that has glass sides. It's at room temperature. Now, mice are good swimmers, but they don't like water because you can drown. So here's a picture of the experiment. The control group is put in and they try to escape for 4 minutes. But after 4 minutes, they give up and they go into a dead mouse float. And psychologists call this behavioral despair. So in 4 minutes, they can deal with stress. But after 4 minutes, their ability to deal with stress disappears and they give up. And of course, in nature, they would drown at this point. The lactobacillus mice, however, went on for 6 minutes and never gave up, but they were pulled out because they were becoming fatigued and they would die if they weren't pulled out. So they measured the stress hormones of the two sets of mice. In the control mice, there's twice as much cortisol, which is a hormone, in the control mice, but in the lacto-fed mice, they have half of that cortisol and another chemical called GABA. Now, this cortisol, that's your fight or flight hormone. So the control mice were freaking out from the stress. They were much more freaked out than the lacto mice because the lacto mice had half as much of this fight or flight hormone. Well, why is that? Because GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter made in the brain. So in the brain of the mouse, this GABA is produced, and it has the effect of reducing the nerve cell's ability to send and receive chemical messages throughout the nervous system. So it lowers the stress and anxiety of the control mice. You could say GABA is nature's Valium. Now, I don't know about you, but I would rather be a GABA mouse, a lacto mouse, than the non-lacto mouse, because I don't want to get to the point where I go into despair and burn out and say, oh, what the hell, and give up. But how does the brain get the message from the gut to produce the GABA? How does that all work? Well, there's a nervous system that connects all of your internal organisms, including the gut, to the brain, because your brain has to control your autonomic activities. You know, you don't tell your stomach to digest, your brain does. And your brain then has to know if the digestion is working or not. And you don't tell your liver how to operate, your brain does. And your brain also then has to recognize when there's something wrong with the liver and try to correct it. So it was hypothesized in this experiment that maybe the vagus nerve is how the brain is being told to produce GABA. So what they did in both sets of mice is they cut the vagus nerve, and then they ran the experiment. And when they did, I'm sorry, this picture actually shows the connection between the two. And you'll see the gut microbes send out chemicals that excite the epithelium layer in the intestines. And then the epithelial layer, which is attached to the vagus nerve, then sends that message to the brain. Okay. And in the little square at the top, you can see that the lacto mice show less depression-like behavior in that chart. And the reason is that cortisol is a hormone that causes this fight or flight reaction, but GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter made in the brain that lowers the level of the cortisol and calms the mouse down and lowers the stress and anxiety response. So this proves that the gut bacteria have a direct influence on the secretion of hormones and neurotransmitters by the brains of the mice, and increases the viability of the current and future generations of the mouse with that microbiome. So is it the same for humans? Well, we have a vagus nerve, and it is connected to all of our organs. And a clinical trial was done in France in 2011, where people were fed large doses of probiotics in powder form, and they showed a dramatic reduction in basic anxiety levels. Cortisol went down, they were less angry, and they were in less distress. What happens is it controls the levels of serotonin, and serotonin is an enzyme that's produced in the gut that lowers your anxiety levels and makes you feel good. Serotonin is a feel-good drug when it hits your brain. And 80% of it is made in your gut. So why does your gut want your brain to feel good? Well, when the gut wants you to feel good, it wants you to change your behavior to maybe increase your desire for certain foods, for example, or to make you feel good and help you survive so that it can survive. 50% of your dopamine, another feel-good drug, is produced in your gut, in the cecum. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that helps the brain and the nervous system cells communicate. It stabilizes your mood, it increases your feelings of happiness and well-being, helps with your digestion. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It promotes reward-motivated behavior, because when you feel good, you want to do it again, whatever it was. And it's also involved in motor control and fine motor control. And dopamine, if it goes below certain levels, your motor control diminishes and you end up with a disease such as, and what's the name of that disease where you can't control your muscles and your hands shake? And I can't think of the name for it, but it'll come up later. Now, the microbiome, if we consider it an organ, is the only organ that can be replaced without surgery. So they're doing today a lot of different clinical trials to see if they can introduce different kinds of microbes or the chemicals produced by those microbes in a way to treat or prevent different kinds of disease. If they can change the microbiome, then maybe they can change the impact of a behavior or a disease, right? So let's look at an example of that. There's a disease that is caused by a particular microbe. It's called Clostridium difficile. Difficile is Latin for difficult, so obviously it's a bad one. And it's normally present in up to 5% of the population. And if it's at low levels, it won't hurt you. If it's at high levels, it will. And it can be transmitted from person to person through activities like exposure to fecal matter from another person, if you live in a dirty environment. And it can also be transmitted person to person and person to fomite to person. So here's a new vocabulary word for you. It's a very uncommonly used word, but it's a good one to know. A fomite is any inanimate object where germs can live for a while. So like a doorknob. So if somebody who's got C. difficile and they go to the bathroom and they don't wash their hands and they touch a doorknob and you're the next person along to touch that doorknob, you might get it. And what happens when you get this? Your normal flora can be destroyed or altered, by maybe aggressive antibiotic treatment, and that might enable the C. difficile to flourish. And if it does, and you get an imbalance and you get a lot of C. difficile, you'll get diarrhea, you can get intestinal perforation, and you can even die from it. Now, traditionally, we've treated this with antibiotics. Doesn't work very well. Only 30% success rate. And even if it goes away, when the antibiotics wear off and your gut flora tries to recover, the C. difficile can recover better. And that means you're going to get a recurrence of the disease. And because you're taking antibiotics, a lot of your other microbiome is getting killed off, right? And that can have bad effects. So how can you fix this dysbiosis? Well, one way is to have a fecal microbiome transplant. In other words, you take parts of somebody's normal microbiome, create some kind of fecal cocktail from that donor, and introduce it into the sick person. And the way this is done is you get a donor fecal sample, it's filtered, and it's either introduced by an enema or a transcolonic infusion, or they'll put a tube through your nose down into your stomach and introduce it that way. And by introducing that healthy microbiome into this unbalanced microbiome, and it doesn't happen once, it has to go on for an extended period of time, at least a week, they can fix that C. difficile associated disease. And the transplant has an 80 to 90% success rate, so it really works. Now, this kind of treatment is kind of old. It was actually invented 1700 years ago by a Chinese guy named Guihang. And he would just have his patients swallow what he called yellow soup. In 1958, there was a treatment that was developed where they used enemas to do the same thing, and that worked well to prevent diarrhea or cure it. But this model is prime proof of a principle that the healthy gut microbiota can reproducibly correct a severe and specific microbial dysbiosis. So the National Academy of Sciences now promotes the study of the treatment of mental disorders by fixing the microbiome. Other conditions that they're looking at using this kind of treatment are all sorts of antibiotic-associated diseases like diarrhea, C. difficile infection, constipation, and so on. Some of them respond very well to fecal microbiome treatment. One is ulcerative colitis. And ulcerative colitis, before this was discovered, was considered untreatable. And if you got it, they would actually remove part of your intestine as the cure, if you can imagine. Some diseases like Crohn's disease, which is also associated with your microbiome, does not respond to fecal microbiome transplant. So they're having mixed results. But the problem is this: traditional treatments that all started with the discovery of germ theory were all based on the premise that A, germs are bad, they cause diseases, and B, the way to fix things is to kill off all the germs you can. What they didn't realize at the time was that killing off all the germs you can actually causes a bunch of diseases. So this traditional treatment that targeted the symptoms didn't really help all that much. Now, germ theory is a great thing, and it has cured an awful lot of diseases and prevented a lot of deaths, but it's also contributed to a lot of problems that we have, and I'll show you that in a minute. But all kinds of things are associated with this: infant colic, sepsis, dental caries, periodontal disease, rhinitis, asthma, dermatitis, allergies, and on, skin diseases, diabetes, ovary problems, autism, of all things, turns out is very closely associated with the microbiome. And it's proven by the fact that it responds to fecal microbiome transplant. So the discovery of germ theory, good thing, right? Cured rheumatic fever, hepatitis A, tuberculosis, mumps, measles, all of these went way down. But at the same time, immune disorders went way the hell up. Multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and asthma, all on the rise at the same time. So if you consider this correlation, not necessarily causation, but the correlation is very strong. One of the things that we also know is that the diversity of microbiota in different populations is huge. You can see that the diversity in populations of microbiota in the USA, that's the blue circle, is very different than the microbiome population of Malawians and American Indians. And that's also true in adults, same thing. The previous chart, by the way, that's in babies, this is adults, but it's the same correlation there. And a lot of it has to do with diet. So in the US, we don't eat a lot of plants because we're idiots, and we eat a lot of sugar. And that's one of the problems. We don't have as much contact with nature as those other populations. We take a lot of antibacterials where those other populations do not. And we take a lot of antibiotics where those other populations do not. So this business of how we eat, how much contact we have with nature, and nature is filled with microbes, right? And what we're exposed to in terms of what we gargle with and what we wash our hands with and what we wash our hair with and the antibiotics we take has a big impact on the populations of bacteria. So if you do a Google experiment again and you look up human microbiome, you get 64.8 million hits. If you look up diabetes, type 1 diabetes, which you see is related to the microbiome, you get over 1 billion hits. This leads me to conclude that the amount of research done in type 1 diabetes does not include a lot of interest, at least up till now, on the human microbiome. So we've just learned that type 1 diabetes is associated with the microbiome, but the research to fix it using the microbiome isn't really there yet. Now, 80% of your immune system resides in the lining of your gut. So again, microbiome is important. If you look at things like asthma around the world, you'll notice that it's pretty high all around the world, with the exception of Mexico. It's only 3.3%, China, 2.1, Russia, 2.2, Indonesia, 1.1. But in the westernized, anglicized world of Australia, New Zealand, England, Canada, the US, Brazil, it's high. Celiac disease is on the rise. It's 4.5 times more likely than it was 60 years ago. Food allergies have increased 50%. Peanut and tree nut allergies, 3 times more common. Mostly confined to the Western world. Type 1 diabetes is 10 times more likely for an Englishman than a Pakistani, unless the Pakistani moves and becomes an English person. Then they are just as likely to get diabetes as the Englishman. On a global scale, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization reported that our food diversity has dropped 75% in the last 100 years. So food diversity is a big problem as well. And we've seen that the microbiome is connected with the gut and is connected with the brain. So we call this the gut-brain axis, and it's associated with an awful lot of stuff. Obesity, depression, what you eat, what you want to eat, how you feel about it, how much pain you suffer from things like inflammation, autism. And inflammation, by the way, is a leading contributor to many, many diseases, multiple sclerosis, and cardiovascular risk, all associated. The resistance to germ-free mice to autism behaviors based on fecal microbiome transplant is directly shown. And you can see it in the chart on the right there. The autism in germ-free mice, germ-populated mice is very low. Autism in germ-infected mice with B. fragilis is very high. So apparently, I got that backwards. I'm sorry. Number of cells. I'm sorry. I'm not sure how to interpret the chart, but it demonstrates that having the right microbiome helps you not have autism. And they've done experiments where they've actually done tests on the behavior using the resistance chemicals that appear in the brain. Same has been done with multiple sclerosis with mice. Fecal microbiome transplant lowers the probability of having multiple sclerosis and the symptoms of having multiple sclerosis. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. 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 So let me get back to it. Another thing that's been done is there have been well-known studies that have shown that the gut microbiome differed between identical twins. In one case, one was obese and one was healthy. Okay, and one thing that shows is the microbiome is not a DNA thing, all right? The microbiome is separate from your genetics. And another thing they did was they took the microbiome from the fat person and they put it in a mouse, and that mouse started to get fat. They took the microbiome from the thin person and put it in a mouse, and that mouse did not get fat. So it was the tendency toward obesity was associated with the microbiome itself. They've also done experiments that show that it affects your cholesterol and triglyceride levels, contributes to heart disease. And in terms of diet, they found that an unhealthy species of gut microbiome contributes to heart disease by producing a chemical TMAO. And this chemical contributes to blocked out arteries. Well, it turns out that TMO comes from eating red meat and other animal-based food sources. So the microbiome, if you have the wrong balance, eating this red meat is going to produce this TMAO, which increases the risk factors for heart disease. So one thing you can do is try to fix your microbiome. The other thing is you could avoid eating red meat. The gut microbiome also can help control blood sugar, and that affects diabetes. Diversity of the microbiome drops suddenly in infants just before the onset of type 1 diabetes. And the unhealthy bacterial species increased just before the onset of type 1 diabetes. So there's a correlation. But again, we don't know which is the cause and which is the effect in this case. Another study found that people that ate the same food but had different bacteria in their guts reacted to blood sugar differently. Brain health associated with neurotransmitters. And again, serotonin and dopamine are produced in the gut. The gut's physically connected to the brain through about 100 million nerves that are all part of that vagus nerve system, and they might also impact how your other organs are able to communicate to the brain. And there's some interest in some research going in that direction. People with irritable bowel syndrome have 30% more anxiety and 30% more depression than people that don't have irritable bowel syndrome, which is associated with the microbiome. And it turns out that if you go through stressful experiences, which are experienced in the brain, they cause the IBS flare up within the next 3 months. Now, certain probiotics, if you take them, can improve symptoms of depression. And I actually have relatives who have experienced this as a result of this presentation. They've changed their eating habits and their level of depression actually went down. So your digestive system can confirm that something you ingested has a positive or negative survival potential over the short and the long term. And stress in the brain can signal the gut to respond with serotonin and GABA and affect your ability to respond to stress. And this information alone is enough to qualify it to be something that impacts the viability of current and future generations. So there's an evolutionary advantage, definitely, in this kind of interface. So here's all the stuff that lives in various places in your gut. You can see not much going on in your stomach, a little more happening in your small intestine, but most of it's going on in your large intestine and most of that down in the cecum. So what impacts all of this? Well, let's start at the bottom. We already said how you're born makes a difference. Natural birth or C-section. How you're fed. Are you breastfed? Are you bottle fed? Where does your diet go from there? What kind of foods are you presented with? what's the variety of food you're presented with? Are these foods that are good for a healthy microbiome or foods that disrupt a healthy microbiome? It turns out artificial sweeteners, for example, are bad for a healthy microbiome, where sugar is actually good for a healthy microbiome. So sugar is a better thing for you, or natural sweeteners that are found in foods that are naturally sweet, than things like artificial sweeteners. How much stress you're subjected to in your daily life, how much exercise you get in your daily life have an impact on your microbiome. Your exposure to pharmaceuticals and bacteria-resistant chemicals is going to have an impact, and where you live has a big impact. Because if your neighbors have healthy microbiomes, you're likely to have a healthier microbiome. If the food you eat is locally grown and it's a good variety of food, you're likely to have a better, healthier microbiome. What stage of life you're in has an impact on how your microbiome is organized at that point in your life. And there are other things that aren't even shown in this chart. People that live with a dog are healthier than people that do not live with a dog. And it's got to be because they're exposed to the microbiome of the dog. Now, what they're looking at today in terms of dealing with the microbiome in positive ways, they're coming up with phage therapies that will kill off bad bacteria that are known to disrupt your microbiome. They're coming up with microbial GMOs, where they take a microbe that produces a chemical that's known to be beneficial. They genetically modify the microbe to do that in quantities and maybe produce a drug based on that, or give you the microbe itself in a pill form. And of course, targeting dietary changes that can affect your microbiome. So you want to improve your skin microbiome. Well, one thing is don't over sanitize. A big thing that happens in the US is everybody washes their hand with soap, and it's usually an antibacterial soap, or they go to the grocery store, get in the car, and immediately use an antibacterial on their hands. And they're, constantly killing off as many bacteria as they can, because we've been taught since we were infants that germs are bad, bacteria is bad, kill the bacteria. So we have lots of antibacterial products. And it turns out that now they think babies that get eczema are getting it because of too much sanitization of the baby. To combat this, you can moisturize your skin. That helps. And better to use something natural than something chemical. And it turns out petroleum jelly is just fine for moisturizing. Doesn't hurt you at all. Eat a balanced diet. Foods that are good for your microbiome are called prebiotics. They're actually more important to your health than probiotics are, because you could have the best microbiome in the world, but have a bad diet, and the good microbes don't thrive in that environment. So eating indigestible carbs like fiber that are good bacteria really like, that's a good thing. These are plant-based foods. So that's what you should eat. Exercise, that changes your gut microbiome in a good way. It benefits your skin microbes too. To improve your oral microbiome, don't use antimicrobials in oral hygiene. Listerine, people gargle with Listerine. We've been told to gargle with Listerine since we were, again, small children. It's antibacterial. You're killing off the microbes in your mouth. Brushing with the wrong toothpaste is bad. Detergent-based toothpastes are bad. These are the things that they put in toothpastes, and they all have bad effects. I checked out the toothpaste I was using when I put this together. It contained 3 of these things. One that causes mouth sores, cracking of the lips, artificial sweeteners, which, don't swallow them, they're bad for you. Stannous fluoride, an antimicrobial. Now, supposedly, this stuff was supposed to be good for my teeth. Turns out it wasn't. I checked with the toothpaste my wife was using. She didn't like mine. She had 4 of them. So I did a little research. It's easy to do. I found easily 3 toothpastes that were not bad for you. Okay. You also want to avoid foods with antibiotics. Now, what foods have antibiotics? Well, anything that was farm raised in a factory farm, be it a chicken or a cow or a pig, it's been fed antibiotics if you live in the US. And so you're eating those antibiotics. They're being passed down to you. Avoid over-medication. If you don't need an antibiotic because you've got a virus, don't take the antibiotic. But this is a common practice. Doctors will often, you go to them, you have a virus, you have a cold, you have the flu, they'll give you an antibiotic. No reason to, and it kills off your microbiome. And if you do take antibiotics, be conscious of the fact that you have to restore your gut microbiome. Do something. Short chain fatty acids are important. Where do they come from? They come from plant-based foods. Acetate and butyrate are important, and they do not come from animal-based foods. So, people that eat a lot of meat and very few vegetables have a tendency not to get these. So there's 3 things. There's prebiotics, that's food. There's probiotics, that's your gut microbe supporting intake. And there's symbiotics, which actually combine the 2 of them, right? So prebiotics are non-digestible food components, fiber, that selectively stimulate the growth or activity of desirable microorganisms. So, eat an apple. Apples are good for you. Eat fruit. That's good for you. That includes a bunch of stuff that you can't digest, but your microorganisms can. They eat it, they thrive, and prebiotics have more of an impact on your gut microbiome than probiotics do. Tryptophan is a prebiotic that you get from things like, famously turkey. But it causes your gut to convert it into serotonin that makes you gruntled. And gruntled, there's another word for you to add to your vocabulary. You've heard that people are disgruntled. Well, gruntled is the opposite of that. It also converts it to melatonin, which is why, famously, eating a lot of turkey makes you sleepy. And it also includes vitamin B3, which affects your blood cholesterol. So tryptophan is important. Now, it comes from turkey, but it comes from other things as well. A shortage of tryptophan in the diet means you're going to be more disgruntled, and you may have trouble sleeping, and you're going to be subject to cardiovascular disease. So where do you get tryptophan? A whole bunch of places: eggs, beans, oat bran, shellfish, tuna, cod, haddock, chicken breasts, lamb shoulder, mozzarella, other cheeses, soybeans, squash seeds, pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, and so on. Now, I mentioned before that Ozzy has a copy of this slide deck, so you don't have to memorize this stuff or take screenshots. You can get it from Ozzy later. Tyrosine is another thing you want. Your gut turns that into dopamine and epinephrine. Epinephrine. That comes from steak, chops, salmon, turkey, firm tofu, milk, yogurt, and cheese, beans, and wild rice. Dopamine is involved in motor control. Oh, that's what I was trying to think of before. A lack of dopamine, if it gets low enough in your system, it actually contributes to Parkinson's disease. And that's why Parkinson's patients can't control their muscles, not enough dopamine, and it makes them shake. Indole 3-lactic acid creates indole propionic acid in your gut, and that's one of the strongest antioxidants. That comes from cultured foods. I'll talk about cultured foods in a minute. Polyphenols, important. They have anti-aging properties, improve learning and memory, manage your blood pressure, lowers your risk of diabetes, lowers the risk of cancer, strengthens your immune system. That comes from berries, herbs, and spices, cocoa powder, nuts, flax seeds, vegetables, olives, coffee and tea, red wine. And here's a whole list of prebiotic foods. Now, you could memorize this list, or you could say, I should be eating the Mediterranean diet. Turns out the Mediterranean diet, which is well documented, is filled with prebiotics. That's why the Mediterranean diet is the healthiest diet on the planet. So that's what you want to emulate. That's what you want to eat. And it's now being implied to, believe it or not, a new study called nutritional psychiatry, which reflects something Hippocrates said thousands of years ago: let food be our medicine. He had it right. So if your microbiome is not healthy, you're not going to do all those conversions that we talked about, and you're not going to feel good. So what's a healthy microbiome in your gut? Well, it's diversity. But if you have a diversity and you only eat foods that are high in fat, guess what? The microbes that thrive on fat are going to replicate, and the microbes that are not good at eating fat will not. And then you're going to get a skewed ratio and you're going to be unhealthy. So you have to have diversity in what you eat. If you have a lot of fat and you get a lot of microbes that thrive on fat, they're going to send a message to your brain. You know what that message is? Eat more fat. So you get into a syndrome that makes you want to eat more fat, makes the microbes that thrive on fat reproduce, makes them then send more of the chemical signal to your brain that makes you want fat. And you get into a really bad thing. So one way to fix yourself is force yourself to have a diversity of foods. Symbiotics are, again, a mix of prebiotics and probiotics. So an example of that is kimchi. Kimchi is a fermented food, and the fermentation gives it a byproduct of indole-3 lactic acid. And it also is made from a Napa cabbage, which is a prebiotic. So it's both. It's a probiotic, feeds a lot of good bacteria, and it's a prebiotic because it's got a lot of fiber in it. Now, probiotics alone help your body maintain a healthy community of microorganisms, right? Or they help you return to a healthy condition after you've been taking, say, a lot of antibiotics for whatever reason. And they produce substances that have desirable effects, and they influence your body's immune response. So you're going to have a tendency to be healthy and stay healthy if you get a lot of probiotics. So this is something you can consciously do. The top 7 probiotics that you can eat are kefir, kimchi, Bulgarian yogurt, which you'll remember from the beginning of this presentation, kombucha tea, sauerkraut, something called natto, and pickles. Now, kefir is a kind of fermented milk product. What you see in the spoon there, those are called kefir grains. It's also pronounced kefir in some countries. And kefir grains, you add them to milk, you let the milk sit at room temperature overnight, and in the morning you have a bunch of kefired milk. You take out the kefired grains, put them in another jar of milk, put it aside for 24 hours, and you drink the kefired milk. It includes tryptophan, calcium, vitamin K2 to help you digest the calcium, protein. I think it's 10% of your daily required amount of protein in 8 ounces. Potassium, phosphorus, vitamins A, D, B12, B2, and C. Now, B12, remember I said you only get from red meat and certain other foods. This is one of those other foods. So kefir, if you're a vegetarian, kefir is really important because it helps you get that B12 you otherwise wouldn't be getting. It's got 10 times the probiotics of yogurt. And there's something you see in fermented foods called CFUs, colony-forming units. And you see kefir has 15 to 27 billion colony-forming units. So it's the most powerful probiotic. Kimchi comes in second with 5 billion CFUs. It doesn't have nearly as much stuff as kefir. It doesn't have the vitamins that vitamin B that kefir has and so on, but it's good stuff. I make my own kefir, by the way, and I make my own kimchi. Bulgarian yogurt has Bacillus bulgaricus in it and other ingredients. Now, the stuff you buy in the store, I've got to warn you, may or may not have living cultures. And if they're not living cultures, it's not going to be as good. So you want to check the label. Make sure it's got live cultures if you're going to buy this stuff in a store. Kombucha tea you can make yourself, but it's a pain in the butt. You can also buy it in the store. It's got the vitamins B that you want to have. But again, let me warn you, when you buy it in the store, it could have live cultures or not. It can have sugar in it. They flavor it. They dress it up to make it more palatable and, of course, destroy the effectiveness of it. So sauerkraut, I was making my own sauerkraut, but I just buy it now. It's a lot easier. This is also good. Natto is a Japanese food, and just the looks of it, I'm not going to try it, but other good stuff. Pickles, of course, good for you. Not a lot of the things you're looking for, but vitamin C and A and iron and calcium. So, okay, it's still good stuff. So one last thing, there's a lining of your stomach called the mucosal membrane. And if it's degraded, it can lower your immune response, because remember, it's a mucosal membrane that allows your gut to help talk to your brain, right? So if it's degraded, it lowers your immune response. You can get inflammation and even something called leaky gut, which is terrible, terrible. But if you have a healthy microbiome, if you get more plant fiber, you're going to generate something called butyrate. And butyrate is converted to mucin, and that actually repairs the mucosal membrane. So how do you do that? Well, you want to minimize animal protein. So I hate to do it if you're not prone to being a vegetarian or not vegetarian leaning, but eating animal protein, you're eating methionine and cysteine. It's converted to sulfur, and the sulfate that it produces reduces bacteria, and it produces hydrogen sulfide gas, and that breaks down the mucosal membrane. So lay off the animal protein, especially the red meat. That's the bad stuff. And the other thing is skip breakfast or just drink something for breakfast, because that even gives your mucosal membrane time to restore itself, which it can't do if there's food passing through there constantly. So give it time to repair. Eat starches because they produce serotonin, versus eating a lot of protein because that reduces serotonin. So having told you all of this, now you know things you didn't know before. But there's an old Buddhist saying, to know and not to do is not to know. So how you know? Now you know. So what do? Change your diet. Go to the Mediterranean diet. Back off on the meat. Fish is good. Cheese is good. Wine is good. Minimize your stress. If you don't know how to meditate, learn. If you don't want to learn how to meditate, learn how to do circular breathing, or, just how to reduce stress. Get exercise. Don't over-medicate. Don't over-sanitize. Avoid fomites like dirty door handles. Stay gruntled, right? Eat the right things. Keep yourself feeling good, contented, happy. And that's the prescription for today. And that's my talk. So it's 10 minutes to 12. I know this is a long talk, but if you have any questions, you want to stick around and chat about this, I'm here, you're here. Let's do it. Anybody? Okay, well, if nobody has anything to say, no questions to ask, um, no comments? Yep. Yeah, and by the way, everybody, Ozzy has these slides. So if you want to click, get a copy of the slide deck. You can go through it at your leisure. You can, if you listen to the recording and you have the slide deck, you can pause the recording, maybe click on a link, go take a look at it, whatever. Mhm. Yes. Yeah, one of the things that I didn't know when I put together my talk on epigenetics was I didn't know that the microbes in your body were sending signals that triggered epigenetic changes, right? So there's a close relationship between a child's diet and what gets triggered in their epigenome, which changes how they do everything, because your epigenome is responsible for when you start producing different chemicals that do different things to you, so yeah, it's all intertwined very tightly. Yep. Yeah. Okay, you'll hear from me. No problem. I think our audience fell asleep. I don't think that's why they're not asking questions or saying anything. Okay. 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 Take care. До свидания.